Hi, my name is Karen Salvemini, and I'm the university's Equal Opportunity Compliance Coordinator and Title IX Coordinator. I am presenting today on the topics of harassment, discrimination, sexual harassment, retaliation, and other prohibited conduct under our university policy on harassment and non-discrimination and the Student Code of Conduct. I want to thank you all for taking on the responsibility of being teaching assistants this year, and want to spend a little time with you today kind of walking through the types of behaviors you might encounter, what your reporting obligations might be depending on the information that you learn, and how you can go about reporting that information. Like I said, I'm Karen Salvemini. I'm part of the General Counsel's office, and I am a lawyer by training. So I went to law school and I practiced for several years before I came to Lehigh. I'm not serving in a legal capacity for the university, which basically means that in my role here at Lehigh, I ensure that we are compliant with our legal obligations in terms of how our policies work and also about how we train and how we educate our campus community on these topics. When we talk about bias and gender violence at Lehigh and the types of behaviors that constitute discrimination and harassment and sexual harassment, these are the types of behaviors that we're talking about. So the ones that are listed here on this screen are the ones that are particularly relevant today for our purposes and for our conversation. These are also all of the topics that fall under my jurisdiction. So if there are behaviors that you think, I don't think that's a bias or gender violence incident, that's probably not going to be something that I would respond to, but other offices at the university likely would. We're going to spend some time going through these behaviors today. If at the end of this presentation you have questions about the types of behaviors that are covered, or you don't understand any of them or one of them and would like more information, please let me know. I'm happy to talk through it. One of the key things I want you to remember while we go through this presentation and even after this presentation is to think about the protected characteristics that are listed here. So if you're in any doubt about whether an incident might be something that falls within the categories I just showed you, think about if there is an identity issue involved. So if there's negative treatment occurring, and it's occurring because somebody identifies in one or more of these categories, or there's a perception that somebody fits into one or more of these categories, the behavior is probably going to fit under one of these categories that are listed. So those are situations where later when we talk about reporting, where you should be reaching out and letting me know about that kind of behavior. So these are the protected characteristics under our policy. If there are negative actions being taken against somebody and it's because of a category or a characteristic that's not listed here, again, that might be behavior we want to address as an institution, but it's not going to be behavior necessarily that my office covers. If you are unsure about why somebody's being treated the way they are, or you think it's because of one of these categories, but you're not certain, err on the side of caution, treat it like it's based on one of these identities and report it. So I thought for walking through these behaviors today, I would create a scenario so we could kind of see in real life what this might look like and what you might encounter. So today I'm introducing you to Andy and Bobby. They're going to be the ones we hang out with for a little bit here. And Andy is a new graduate student. Andy is a teaching assistant, white, female, cisgender, which means outward appearance matches biological identity. And Bobby is a tenured faculty member and Andy's supervisor, and also identifies as white, male, and cisgender as well. So let's see what we should know about Andy and Bobby. So Andy arrives early to a meeting with Bobby before the semester starts. So they're meeting to talk about Bobby's expectations of Andy as a teaching assistant, which I'm hoping happens for all of you as well. Bobby's chatting with another faculty member in the office when Andy overhears Bobby saying, "With so many Asian students in the class, I know I'm going to have to deal with a lot of plagiarism issues this semester." Andy was surprised by the comment, but didn't say anything to Bobby when Bobby opened the office door. So initial thoughts here are probably that's a problem, but not sure whether that's something that needs to be addressed or whether that's an issue that the university would deal with. And so the first thing I want to talk about is what is that statement, or what could it be classified as? So microaggressions are common everyday type comments. They're often unintentional, but they can be intentional comments as well that communicate hostility. They might be derogatory in nature. They might be a slight or an insult, but they're targeted towards one of those marginalized groups or marginalized identities that I showed you as protected characteristics. There are different forms of microaggressions, but generally speaking, the idea is generally targeted comments about a minority group or a marginalized group, and many times they involve stereotypes. So in this comment here, you saw that Bobby said something along the lines of Asian students have a lot of plagiarism issues. That's a stereotype about Asian students, right? I have this video that I show. I hope it shows up in this recording for all of you to see, but it's from an MTV program called and the title of the program is If Microaggressions Happen to White People. And basically this video flips the microaggression. So typically the microaggression is targeted towards the minority and the marginalized group. In this video, you're going to see that flip to the majority group, right? So how do white people respond, or how are white people reacting in this video to microaggressions? And I'm hoping that this highlights for you what microaggressions are, how they impact people, and why we want to address them as an institution. We want to stop these types of statements from happening, and in that way, we would be able to prevent harassment and discrimination from occurring as well. So I'm going to show this video. For some people, it might be considered offensive or impactful. I know that, sometimes it's really uncomfortable to see these types of videos play out, but I think it's helpful in highlighting why microaggressions are problematic.
So you're not good at golf, but you're white. People of color have to deal with racial microaggressions every single day. So microaggressions are those little unintentional insults that basically see people of color as stereotypes, which got me thinking, what if white people had to deal with racial microaggressions?
So, where are you from?
No, where are you really from?
Why do you have an accent? Like a Swedish accent.
Your English is really, really good. It's like I can't even tell you have an accent or anything.
I don't have an accent.
No, that's what I'm saying.
You don't speak Gaelic?
You don't speak German?
Can you say a curse word in European?
What does that even mean?
Hey, Connor, do you know about NASCAR stuff, right? Can you take a look at this?
Can you teach me how to line dance?
Play the banjo?
Act entitled in the supermarket.
Love white food. No real flavor to it. Never an upset tummy.
You're so exotic.
How do you get your hair like that? I love how it's so limp. Ew, why does it feel like that? Oh my God, so it just does that? No, you are really pretty for a white girl.
Your eyes are so round, like this.
You know who you look like? Kenny Chesney. Zach Braff.
Emma Stone.
Rachel Maddow.
My friend Chad. Maybe you know him, because he's white too.
No, Emma Watson.
Not Macklemore. What's the other guy?
No, is it Emma Thompson?
It's CHAD, like Chad.
One of the Emmas. You look like an Emma.
You know who you look like? I bet you hear this all the time. Jeffrey Dahmer. How does it feel to be the token white guy in the office? Hey, Connor, can we get a white perspective on this? I love everything about white culture. You guys are like so fun. What do you mean you don't listen to Creed? You're white.
You've never tried meth. But you're white.
You don't act like a normal white person.
You're not really white, though.
Not really white. I'm whiter than you are. So, did all your ancestors own slaves?
No, but of course he wishes that he could still own slaves. That's a part of his culture.
Bryce, back me up on this one. The thing you have to understand about white culture
No, I
is
went
that
to
white
an
people
historically white college, so I know about white culture.
I backpacked in Europe. So can you say how ridiculous this was? I know. Story of my life.
So I hope that helped to highlight what microaggressions are and what they look like and the impact that could be had on other individuals when they're experiencing a microaggression. The next type of behavior I want to introduce you to are bias incidents. So microaggressions and bias incidents tend to be the types of behaviors that are based on those protected characteristics, but they are not quite at the level of harassment yet. They're usually the precursors to creating a harassing or hostile environment. And so they're behaviors that as a university we address and we want to prevent them from continuing. So it's really important that you have a sense of what bias incidents are so you can report them as well. So bias essentially and bias incidents are really behavior that's motivated by somebody's preformed negative opinions or attitudes towards a group of people based on their common characteristics or their cultural expectations. So I think that all Asian people deal with plagiarism issues, right? So going back to Bobby's comment to, that Andy overheard, it's a preformed negative opinion, right? That's applied towards all people of that group because they are all Asian identifying people. And so if, an incident occurred because of that bias, that would be a bias incident. The one thing I want to point out is, there's a lot of conversation about unconscious or implicit bias. And those words are commonly used interchangeably. You might hear unconscious bias used, you might hear implicit bias used, but the idea is that as people, we all have biases, right? And it's not just in regard to people of different identities, but it's into all kinds of different things, right? And we have conscious biases and we have unconscious biases. And sometimes those attitudes or stereotypes that we have influence our beliefs, our understandings, our actions, our decisions, but we're not aware of it, right? Because we're not aware consciously that we have that bias. And so we know that these unconscious or implicit biases can be found for all of us and can impact the way that we interact, right? And so we know from research that the impact on general group interactions when somebody of a different identity or a different belief or a different of something impacts the way that we interact with them. We have seen unconscious bias studies in noticing how medical professionals might treat patients. We've seen it in discrimination and racial and ethnic disparities, and that unconscious piece kind of playing out in hiring decisions or the way that promotions are given. And so I point this out because I want you to be aware that this unconscious or implicit bias is in each of us, and to consciously try to spend some time thinking about where those biases might be for you. In being a teaching assistant, you're going to be interacting with all kinds of different people, and you're going to be responsible for teaching them and working with them and educating them and grading them. And, we want to, and it's really important that in those processes, you're aware of how you might react to different people. And it's not that it's intentional often, or that it's, something that you should be ashamed of. It's just something to be conscious of, right? We all, when we're aware of what our biases are, we can take action to not act on them, right? And so if you're thinking, well, how am I supposed to know what my biases are? Or, how can I assess that so I can think about how I interact with people? I would encourage you, one of the leading places to go for like a free way to gauge your own bias is through Project Implicit. So through Harvard, and there's different tests you can take that look at your bias in different areas towards different identities. And it's not just based on the protected characteristics that I showed you. There's some that are based on political affiliation and other factors like that. So it's something that if you're looking for more information or ways to improve the way that you might teach, or the way that you might run your classroom, or how you might grade, something that you might want to think about and be more conscious of for yourself. So let's pick up with Bobby and Andy. I'm not convinced after hearing Bobby's comment that Bobby's very conscious of his bias, right? So let's see if he's able to change his behavior, right? So over the first few weeks of the semester, Andy observes Bobby treat Asian American female undergraduate students dismissively. Bobby talks over them. He's made comments to Andy about how his Asian girls aren't usually this talkative. So my impression is Bobby either has an unconscious bias or he's aware, right? But either way, he's not reining in these comments, right? He's making these biased or stereotype statements about Asians, and now particularly about Asian women. So when I hear this ongoing type of behavior, this makes me start to think about, is this possibly a harassment situation? And so our definition of harassment at the university is here on your screen. And these are the types of metrics I go through to figure out, all right, are we looking at a harassment situation yet? Or are we looking at still that bias microaggression level, which we're still going to address, but there might be different ways of how we address it. So here, when we talk about harassment, we're looking for unwelcome conduct that's sufficiently serious and based on a protected characteristic that creates an intimidating or offensive work or academic environment, or denies somebody's ability to participate in university programs or activities. So breaking this down a little bit, key things to know, we're looking for some kind of impact on the educational environment or the work environment. So you as TAs, you're in this dual role, right? You are students and you're going to be in student situations where you're working with your advisor or with the supervising faculty member that you work for. And you have, you're in that employment situation when you're in your TA role, but you're also a graduate student when you're in the classroom or you're engaging in your educational opportunities. So I wanted to point that out because the prohibition against these types of behaviors and, prohibition against harassment applies to you in terms of impact on you as a student and an employee, and then also based on your role, right, being in that authority role as a TA over those undergraduate students. So it's just something for you to keep in mind. You may be experiencing this, it may be reported to you, you may see it happening. Harassment can take different forms. One of the things to note about harassment that I haven't already pointed out to you all is that harassment is looking for conduct that's severe or pervasive. So this could be a one-time physically violent event, such as somebody gets in a fist fight over somebody's sexual orientation, right? Or it could be pervasive. And this is the type of situation where we see events happening over time. So for example, here, Bobby started with a comment that Andy overheard before classes started. And then Andy is hearing Bobby making more comments about Asian women and acting dismissively towards them, right? Not really calling on them, that sort of thing. So we're looking at a series of actions, not necessarily a one-time event. Again, if there's a physically violent aspect to the harassment, then yes, that might be a one-time event that's sufficient to meet this definition. But more often than not, we're looking for that pattern of events over time. The other thing I'll mention here that's not necessarily implicated in this scenario yet is discrimination. And so we talk about harassment and discrimination a lot together, so I wanted to make sure to cover it here. Discrimination is when somebody is subjected to negative or adverse treatment because of their identity, and it denies or limits their abilities to work or to access their educational benefits. So harassment's a form of discrimination, which is why the definitions look similar, but discrimination is usually a discrete act. So it's usually something along the lines of, you're not permitted to join this student organization because of your race. You're not hired for a work study job because of your religion. You're not, permitted you're graded differently because you identify as LGBTQ, right? So there's a action that somebody can point to say, I was treated differently and this is how, right? I got a different grade. I wasn't given a job. I wasn't eligible for an organization. So moving on, right? In years where we had pacing breaks, we'd be like halfway through the semester at this point. And right before pacing break, Andy meets with an undergrad student in her lab to talk about grades. And Daniel, the undergrad student, is very concerned And Andy's reassuring him that there's time to get his grade up. He still has half the semester. And Andy thinks she's being funny, and she says to Daniel, you know, I can make sure your grade is better if you go on a date with me. Daniel laughs and says he might have to consider that option, and leaves the meeting. So I'm thinking that some of you are thinking, all right, so what? Andy thought it was funny. Daniel laughed, so he's probably fine with it. So this probably isn't anything. Aren't we allowed to joke around, right? And some of you might be thinking like, Andy, that's totally inappropriate. Like, what are you thinking? And then questioning like, okay, but Daniel laughed, so now what? Like, what does that mean? So let's talk this through. So sexual harassment under our policy has a different definition and its own definition than the standard harassment definition. So you'll see a lot of similarities, right? Like unwelcome conduct, got it. Severe and pervasive, got it. Denies a person equal access to the university's education program or activity, right? So similar aspects to generally harassment. Sexual harassment obviously is based on sex, as stated in the title, and it's looking for both the objective offense, so somebody is objectively offended by the behavior, and also looking at, does a reasonable person who's watching this happen, would they be offended? Would they find that kind of behavior offensive? And is it so severe and pervasive, right? So before I said you need a one-time severe event like physical violence or a series of events over time. When we're talking about sexual harassment in particular, we're looking for both. So it's got to be severe, so that like really high level violence type aspect, and pervasive. So happening, impacting all areas of their education or happening over a period of time, right? So we're looking for a lot of different factors here. I'm not sure that just making this statement to Daniel is going to be rising to this level of sexual harassment, right? It's uncomfortable, and but we're not sure what else is going on here, right? The one thing we do know is Andy made a comment that seems to imply that if Daniel goes on a date with her, that she'll make sure he gets better grades. And maybe that's a joke and maybe it's not, but here's the issue. Andy is an employee in this position of the university, right? She's a TA and she's getting paid, and she's conditioning a benefit, right, from the university, so his grade improving, on Daniel going on a date with her, right? So the date, the definition here looks at unwelcome sexual conduct. So is asking for a date unwelcome sexual conduct? I don't know, it could be. If she had explicitly said, would you have sex with me, right? That absolutely would. But the implication's there, right? And so even though Daniel might have laughed, we don't know what's in Daniel's head right now. We don't know if Daniel laughed because he was uncomfortable, right? Some people laugh when they're uncomfortable. He might have laughed to cover up that he didn't know what to say, right? He might have been totally fine with it. We don't know that either. So that unwelcome piece is an open question. We don't know. But what I do know is that it's not appropriate for Andy to make that kind of statement to somebody who is her subordinate, right? Because she's the employee and this is the person she's working to teach, right? And, this would be a similar situation where if you as the TA and your supervising faculty member would make a comment like that, right? That is potentially a quid pro quo situation, could potentially be sexual harassment and inappropriate. So my suggestion is, you don't know if that was welcome or unwelcome, right? The intent behind Andy making the comments irrelevant. Even if Andy thought it was a joke, doesn't matter. What matters is the person hearing the comment, what they thought. And so I wanted to just mention for you all to think about professional boundaries, right? So you are graduate students who have been through your undergrad experience. And now we're in this professional capacity interacting with those undergraduate students, right? So that can be really difficult because you are teaching those students, right? And yet you are a student. So some of that social piece, right, might feel strange because you're still a student and yet not in this situation. So I would like you to start thinking about professional boundaries. So what guidelines, rules, limits are you going to put in place for yourself to help maintain professionalism and to avoid issues like Andy just walked into with Daniel, right? So making that kind of a comment or making that kind of a joke, is that appropriate in a teaching situation, right? Should a TA be making that kind of comment to an undergrad? This isn't necessarily a situation where, you know, you're just hanging out with friends and making that kind of a joke, right? This is a situation where Andy actually does have the authority and ability to impact Daniel's grade. So think about those parameters. Think about the way that you want to interact with those undergraduate students you're educating and you're working with. Think about what kind of boundaries, right? We all need to have professional boundaries. One of the ways I do that is, this is such a silly thing, and I use this example because it is silly, but it also highlights the point. So for me, I, on social media, am really not friends with any Lehigh employees. I just really have never done that. That's a carryover from my job before coming to Lehigh of, you know, maintaining professional boundaries and things like that. And so when I came to Lehigh, I decided, you know, based on my role here at Lehigh, I don't know that it's appropriate for me to be friends with a lot of my coworkers because they might feel uncomfortable if they saw something on my page that they didn't like or didn't agree with. And then, you know, would have to come talk to me about some sensitive stuff. So, for example, one of the things on my Facebook page is the fact that I'm, you know, a big Cowboys fan, Dallas Cowboys fan. And I live in Eagles territory, right? Like some of you may be big Eagles fans and you may have heard me say the word Dallas Cowboys and shuddered, right? And had a totally different opinion about me now, which I understand. Being a Cowboys fan, I understand how Eagles fans react. And that's a silly thing, but it's one of those examples that I give because you'll never be able to unknow that I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan, right? And it might make you feel uncomfortable knowing that about me. It may make it hard to put employer like boundaries in place between you and the student, right? So it's just something to think about, setting those boundaries for yourself. What feels appropriate for you to be able to maintain those professional boundaries so that you're not Andy, like not really sure what role she plays, right, when she's talking to Daniel. So am I your friend and we're joking, or am I your TA? But since we're talking about grades, obviously I'm your TA in this conversation, and I'm walking right through that professional boundary to the personal side, right? So these are just some ways that you can think about setting those boundaries, you know, and some suggestions about being consistent and maintaining those boundaries. So we're going to move forward to Lehigh Lafayette Week, which sadly usually happens in November, right before Thanksgiving, and is not happening this year. But as many of you know, Lehigh Lafayette Week is a pretty exciting week around here. And, you know, we're nearing the end of the semester at this point. So in her role as a teaching assistant, Andy has also regularly interacted with Charlie, who's a male undergraduate student enrolled in one of her classes. And after class one day, Charlie asked to speak with her confidentially. So this is very important. This is where I need you to really think through what you would do in this situation. So Charlie is an undergrad in your class, comes to you or Andy in this situation and says, I need to talk with you confidentially. This is a point where you should be thinking, there are some things I can't keep confidential, right? And so the behaviors that I talked to you about today, and that I showed you on that very, you know, second slide, are the behaviors that you're going to, in part, need to report. So you can't guarantee confidentiality, right? That's not something you can promise in your role as a TA. So this is an example of a disclosure statement that I've developed over the years. And I do have index cards, so if you want one, I can send it to you. It's also available on my website. So if you want to download it from eocc.lehigh.edu, you can pull this disclosure statement down off the reporting, the posters and brochures page. But the disclosure statement is generally saying, hi, I'm not somebody who can guarantee confidentiality. I'm not a confidential resource for students on campus. Those confidential resources are the counseling center and the chaplain's office. And so here's their contact information. It's also listed here on the card. But because I can't guarantee confidentiality, I want you to know there are certain things that I'm required to report as an employee at the university, but that information is only going to be reported to the individuals that need to know. And that, you know, I'm happy to listen to you if you feel comfortable with that and you want to still share the information. But, you know, I do need you to know up front that I can't promise confidentiality. That's really important for you as a TA to provide that context to the student. We do training for undergraduate students to let them know about that too, and what mandatory reporting looks like and who's a mandatory reporter. But in that moment, they're trusting you and maybe they forgot. So if somebody's saying, if they give you that time, right, they give you that ability, like, can I tell you something confidentially and you not tell somebody, right? Then you'll have the time to say this and give this disclosure statement. But there might be other people who are like, hey, can I talk to you? And all of a sudden they say, well, last night I was sexually assaulted and so I missed class today and I need to do makeup work, right? You didn't get the chance in that situation to do this disclosure statement, and that happens, right? In that situation, I would encourage you to say, you know, support that person, tell them, I'm sorry, you know, I'm sorry you've had this experience. Let me tell you though, you know, let me tell you what I can do and what I'm required to do with that information. And let me see how I can help you and support you, right? Because you want them to know you have to disclose it, but you didn't get the chance to do it before they told you, right? And that happens sometimes. So again, confidential resources for students, counseling and psychological services, and the chaplain's office. They do not have to report that information that's shared there outside their offices. So you do your disclosure statement and Charlie decides, yeah, I still want to talk to you, Andy, because this is really important to me and I don't know what to do. I've been dating Danny for several months. I'm trying to break up with Danny, but Danny's threatening to post naked pictures of me, right? So Charlie's like, I don't know what to do. I want to break up with Danny because Danny shows controlling behavior, shows up places where Charlie is, even though they had no plans for Danny to show up. And Danny's been accessing Charlie's social media accounts without permission. So I think a lot of us can think in this situation, yeah, this is not okay, right? Something's not right. So Danny first mentions, or Charlie mentions to Andy, right? One of the first things is that Danny's threatening to post naked pictures of Charlie if Charlie breaks up with Danny. So in that situation, those pictures may have been consensually shared initially from Charlie to Danny, right? Or not. Maybe Danny took them of Charlie without Charlie knowing. If that's the case, that might be a situation that's sexual exploitation. So taking non-consensual or abusive sexual advantage of another person and exploiting that. So that could be taking pictures or videos or audio recordings of another in a sexual act without their consent. It can be things like if Danny got those pictures consensually. So Charlie sent them to Danny at a time when they were in a good place in their relationship. And, you know, turns out now Danny has those pictures, they want to break up and Danny's pissed about it. And so Danny decides, you know what, I'm going to share these pictures with other people and embarrass Charlie. That would typically be considered sexual exploitation as well and is prohibited by our policies. Dating and domestic violence are also prohibited under our policy. So here's a situation where we know that Danny and Charlie have been in a dating relationship. So they meet that last criteria. They've been in a social or romantic or intimate relationship with each other. It's based on sex, like on their identities and a sexual relationship. And we know that the definition here refers to violence, but violence really means in this situation, not just physical violence, but it means abuse, right? So physical abuse, financial abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, all of those types of things are situations where dating violence occurs. And so here we've got Danny is threatening to share these pictures, showing up in places where Charlie is without knowing that Danny's supposed to be there, and accessing Charlie's social media accounts without permission. So there's a lot of controlling behavior happening here, which may mean Charlie is experiencing dating violence and is in an intimate partner abuse situation. Domestic violence, so and some of you may be in these types of relationships or situations where instead of a social or more casual romantic or intimate relationship, you are in a relationship with an intimate partner, right? So maybe you've married or you've had a domestic partnership, you may share a child, you may cohabitate as intimate partners, any of those kinds of dynamics, right? So if you are in those like legally binding type of relationships and you have that domestic partnership or domestic relationship, that's also prohibited by our policy. The other behavior I'll mention here is stalking. So stalking is a repeated course of conduct directed at a specific person that causes them fear or anxiety. So, Danny's showing up where Charlie is without Charlie having told Danny or knowing that Danny was planning to come there, or without any plans to see Danny there. Over time, that might become stalking, right? It's a repeated course of conduct directed at Charlie specifically, and it's causing Charlie to feel uncomfortable or distressed. He doesn't know why Danny just keeps showing up, and that is potentially stalking. The other piece I'll mention that doesn't seem to be implicated here, but is very important for you all to know, is sexual assault. And so the definition is listed here. Forms of sexual assault include rape, fondling, incest, statutory rape, but it's sexual contact that occurs without the consent of the person. And so consent, our university definition involves, right, to a specific activity, so a specific sexual act, not to every, it has to be to each specific act in an encounter, not just, it's not just I consent to kissing, and so that gives you consent for any other thing that happens after that, right? It needs to be each activity, and it's every time. So if I consented to kissing yesterday, that does not mean I'm consenting to kiss today. You need new consent for that. Consent needs to be given verbally or non-verbally. So it can be orally, I say yes, or I like that, or please do this, or non-verbally through the way my body moves, or the way I might take a partner's hand and put it on a certain body part, things like that. A person cannot give consent if they are incapacitated by drugs or alcohol, if there's force being used, or if somebody is mentally incapable of giving consent. People can also change their minds. So if somebody wants to revoke consent, they initially say yes. They're 20 minutes into kissing the other person, and they say, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. That's revoking consent. People are allowed to do that. And so that communication would say, yep, we need to be done with this activity. Being in a relationship also does not imply consent. So just because people are dating or have a sexual relationship doesn't mean that every single time they have sex that there's just a free pass, right? They need to get consent every time, and consent is still required. Excuse me for one moment. So that's consent. I hope that was helpful to understanding consent. So those are all of the types of sexual harassment type activities that are also covered by our policy that may be implicated by Charlie and Danny's relationship, right? We would need to flesh that a little bit out more, but your job as a TA is not to ask for details, right? Your job as a TA is to take whatever information is given to you, to say thank you. Like here, Andy is thanking Charlie for trusting her with the information, assuring him that she believes and supports him. And then Charlie asks, what's next, right? And so this is very important for you all to know as well. So mandatory reporting. Teaching assistants, graduate assistants, research assistants, in addition to faculty, staff, administrators, Griffins, must report incidents of harassment or discrimination that are brought to their attention by students or that are reported to them or witnessed by them involving students. So this basically means as a TA, you become aware of an incident of harassment, discrimination, sexual harassment, any of the behaviors we talked about today, bias, microaggressions, sexual assault, stalking, dating or domestic violence, sexual exploitation, sexual assault. Those are all behaviors that if they're involving undergraduate students, whether an undergraduate student tells you, a friend of an undergraduate student tells you, you see it happening, you overhear people talking about it, those are all situations where you're required to report. Individuals who serve in supervisory capacities who become aware of these behaviors from anyone at the university are also required to report. I don't think that typically will impact any of you, but it's important for you to know that whoever supervises you has that supervisory requirement as well to report. So how do you report? First of all, these are the reporting options, but there are a lot of resources on my website that you can print out. So there is a reporting poster. This is a magnet. So if you want a magnet, you can reach out to my office for that. There's also reporting pens that some of you may have seen or received if you were an undergraduate here even, that contains all the reporting information in it. So there are resources available to remind you about the reporting options. The first reporting option in any case is LUPD. Lehigh University Police Department are available 24/7, 365. They are on campus all year, and they are the go-to reporting resource if there's an emergency or some kind of safety issue. If you are concerned that the situation needs an immediate response, you should call LUPD. If there's a threat of harm or some kind of safety risk involved, this should be the call. The other 24/7, 365 situation where if you have a disclosure involving a student or you as a graduate student want to report your own experiences, you can call the University Support Advocates. So their phone number again is a 24/7, 365 line. It is staffed by one of the faculty or staff members who's been trained by the Office of Gender Violence Education and Support to support survivors of sexual harassment. So if somebody has experienced sexual assault, stalking, sexual exploitation, dating, or domestic violence, the advocates are well trained to help support the survivor, to work with you as the mandatory reporter, but you can make the report there as well. You can also report to me in my role as the Title IX coordinator and the Equal Opportunity Compliance coordinator. I'm just not a 24/7, 365 resource. So if you call me outside like business hours, I'm not an immediate response back. So if it's an emergency, call LUPD. You can also call the advocates, and then you can also get in touch with me as well. We also have 2 online reporting forms. These forms are asking for information about what's occurred, and we want you to provide all of the information. So no matter what way you report, please provide all of the information that's been given to you. Like I said, you don't have to ask questions, you don't have to get details from the person that they don't offer, but if they do give you information, we need to know everything they told you. So you can fill out these forms, or you can contact us by phone or email, whichever way you prefer. These online reporting forms, when completed, go to myself and to LUPD. So you cover the criminal and the university response as well. There are different university processes depending on what type of behavior has occurred. So I just want you to be aware, I'm just going to go through this very briefly, that there are university processes under our policies for how we as a university respond to these types of behaviors. These are separate from the criminal process, and those can go on simultaneously, but it's a different type of process. It's looking at policy and whether policy has been violated. In cases of any form of harassment or discrimination, informal resolution might be an option. And so forms of informal resolution are mediation or a negotiated resolution for conduct process, or a respondent accepts responsibility and they accept the sanction for what has happened. These are voluntary processes, so both parties have to agree to them, and they will be monitored and overseen by a trained individual to facilitate them. In a sexual harassment case, there's a formal grievance process, which is a disciplinary process. So in specific sexual harassment cases, this involves an investigation and a hearing before a panel. So parties and witnesses and the investigators would testify at a hearing before a panel of three individuals, and that panel would make the decision about whether a policy has been violated. This involves examining witnesses, cross-examination by a party's advisor, and presenting testimony and witness testimony and evidence and things like that. The investigation prior to the hearing would gather information and would be provided to the parties and to the panel in a report. At the end of that process, there are sanctions assessed, remedies provided, and appeal processes available. For all other forms of harassment, there's a similar process, but there's no hearing. So people don't need to go testify in person or provide testimony there. The case is resolved based on an investigation report that's completed. And that investigation report is presented by the investigators to a panel, or in cases involving students anyway, to a panel who makes the decision. So the parties don't have to appear before that panel or provide any additional information there. Supportive measures are available regardless of whether somebody goes through any of these processes or not. So if somebody's experienced these behaviors and I receive a report about them, I'm going to offer them supportive measures and try to put those in place to help them process their experience. So this could be academic support, change of residence hall, change in class schedule, no contact orders, but those are things that I would explore with the person who's been impacted. So we've gotten to the end of the semester, and after Charlie's experience was reported to me, Andy decided that maybe she should report what she's experienced with Bobby. So she contacts me and says she likes to talk about a faculty member, but she's really worried about what would happen. And so we do prohibit retaliation under our policy. We do not, we want people to feel comfortable reporting. We want people comfortable going through a process. We don't want people worrying about, you know, what if I report my supervisor and now I'm being treated poorly or I'm negatively impacted, right? So if somebody comes to me and says, I'm afraid of retaliation, we're going to explore what we can put into place prior to that to help make them feel more comfortable. And if negative action is taken against them in any way, based on the report or going through a process, we would pursue a separate investigation into that retaliation behavior. The last thing I want to wrap up with are campus and community resources. So these are a list of significant resources on campus that do this kind of work or work with me through these processes. The key one for you all is Graduate Life. So Kathleen Hutnick and her team are amazing. They provide amazing support and resources to graduate students, both as students and in your role as TAs. So if you are looking for support and resources, I cannot speak more highly of them and what they do and how they support you all as graduate students. In addition, we have community resources like Bethlehem Police, Crime Victims Council, which is the local rape crisis center, and also the victim support for criminal and civil processes, and then Turning Point of the Lehigh Valley, which is the local domestic violence shelter. Lehigh Valley Hospital and St. Luke's Hospitals also have safe and sane nurses, which can provide forensic evidence exams. If somebody's been sexually assaulted, they would collect evidence and provide medical treatment to the survivor. And so those are great resources as well. So obviously at this point, I can't answer questions virtually because you haven't seen this yet. But if you have questions, you can contact me directly at eocc@lehigh.edu. You can also feel free to reach out to Kathleen Hutnick and the Graduate Life Office with any questions. They can get you in touch with me. And I hope that this was really helpful and valuable. I hope that you won't be in a situation where you have to report and you don't receive a disclosure like this, but you might, and we have had that happen. So I hope you feel well informed and like you know what to do if that happens. The support resources that I mentioned are all available for you too. So as somebody who receives a disclosure, sometimes it can be really a struggle to process what you know and the impact that that's had on another person. And so if you need those resources, please take advantage of them as well. They're also there for you too. I hope that your year goes well. I hope that your role as a teaching assistant is educational and impactful and positive for you all. And I look forward to eventually working with you and talking with you as we kind of all get back to some sense of normalcy, hopefully this year. Take care.